Hi, everyone. Welcome to Saintmaker Podcast, episode number 4. I know in the title of this video it says episode 3 on the various channels, but when we post it permanently, I'll change it to episode 4 because this is in fact episode 4. So, thanks for joining us, and glad to have everybody here. So, I do want to mention that the chat is live, so if you have any comments or questions that you want to drop in the chat, go ahead and do that. I'm not sure I'll be able to handle them or field them during the actual podcast part, because what I'm going to talk about today is actually pretty in-depth. So if you do put your comments, if I do get to them, I'll get to them. Otherwise, leave them in there, and I'll try to answer them at the end. I will answer. I'll take some time to answer some comments at the end. So, all right. So today the plan is to cover Catholic time. So this is a pretty big topic, and what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to summarize as much as I can, and I'm going to treat this as a jumping off point for further exploration. So there are a lot of kind of ins and outs of this, all of which could merit their own podcast or their own blog post or frankly their own book in many cases. So I'm going to do my best to kind of just give you the highlights and kind of start to establish a good foundation for how we might think about these things. And then, like I said, we can do some follow-up down the road. So I do hope at the end of this podcast, I hope that you come away with it with a really good understanding of what is meant by what I mean when I say Catholic time. Secondly, how Catholic time is different than secular time, why that distinction matters, and how adopting a more Catholic view of time can really help with personal spiritual growth, self-mastery, and also growth and development and success in our vocations. So I hope all of that's clear by the end of this. I'm going to do my best. Again, this is a pretty complex topic, so we'll give it what we can and hope for the best. God willing, we can lay this stuff out in a very clear way. So before we get started, I do want to mention that we have a sale going on. So we have our summer Saintmaker sale. It's our pre-order sale, so it's 15% off. That sale ends on June 15th. So if you want to get the discount, if you want a Saintmaker, and if you want to get it before our July seasonal start date, definitely head over there now, check it out, get that 15% discount. Check out the saintmaker.com/shop to do that. And without further ado, we're going to get into it. One more thing, if you do like this, like the video wherever you're watching it, subscribe, comment, and like I said, if you leave some comments, I'm going to try to answer them at the end. All right, so let's get into this. So, what is Catholic time? So, we're going to unpack it kind of from 3 main points of view. So, the first thing to think about is the cycle of the saints. So, let me turn off this little obnoxious advertisement. All right, so we've got the cycle of the saints. The cycle of the saints is also known as the proper of the saints, or the sanctoral cycle. And the proper or sanctoral cycle it consists of fixed days throughout the year. So, for instance, St. Teresa's feast day will always fall on the same day, unless a more important day supersedes it. And then that day, her feast day might be suppressed until next year. So the idea is that these feast days, these saints' feast days, they're usually like a anniversary of a death or of a birth. They are fixed throughout the cycle of the year, right? Now, these days are meant to commemorate particular saints or particular events in church history. The sanctoral cycle is a significant but often downplayed element of the church calendar. Now, why is it downplayed? I don't know. But when I go to weekly mass at a typical parish, I notice that it's not super common to see celebrations of saint feast days. And I think that's bad. I think that's really too bad, because the the feast days of the saints and the sanctoral cycle really present an opportunity for us to learn about the saints and to celebrate their contributions to the faith. That's the first thing. The second thing is we can draw inspiration from their lives and use their examples to succeed in our own vocations. So that's obviously a huge benefit to us as Catholics on a daily basis, right? And then finally, we can ask for their intercession. So that's the purpose for the feast days of the saints and overall the goal of the sanctoral cycle, which is, like I said, all the saint feast days throughout the year. Now, that's kind of the first concept that I want to introduce. The second concept is the cycle of the seasons, all right? So the cycle of the seasons is also known as the temporal cycle or the proper of the seasons. So the temporal cycle it draws us into a deeper experience of the core mysteries of the faith and also the life and teachings of Christ. So one of the amazing things about the temporal cycle is that it not only reveals and signifies things and mysteries of the New Testament, but it also speaks in a mystical way to the Old Testament as well. So a good example of this would be Lent obviously signifies Christ's 40 days in the desert, but it also signifies the 40 years that the Israelites spent wandering in the desert, right? So that happens in various ways throughout the year, but that's one good example. Now, the temporal cycle is movable. So instead of it being fixed, each of those, like I said, the sanctoral cycle has those fixed feast days. The temporal cycle features movable feasts. And the movable feasts are generally calculated with regard to Easter. So whenever Easter falls, that helps us figure out when Ash Wednesday falls, when Palm Sunday falls, when Good Friday falls, Pentecost, etc. It's all calculated in relationship to Easter, right? So these days, they all serve as significant milestones within the liturgical year, and they have typically a higher they have a higher ranking than saint feast days. So again, sometimes they'll kind of like compete for placement, and then the temporal day, the non-sanctoral cycle, the temporal cycle dates will kind of take precedence, right? So Christmas is an exception because it falls on a fixed day every year, but generally they're movable, right? The other thing about the temporal cycle is that it's organized surrounding our main liturgical seasons. So you've got liturgical seasons like Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, the time after Pentecost, time after Pentecost in the old calendar or in the new calendar, ordinary time, etc. So we have these big seasons that kind of help us kind of like make order out of all this, right? Now, I'm going to simplify it a little bit further, right? So one way of thinking about this, I think, that will help you wrap your head around this is we have two major cycles. So cycle one is Christmas. It's the Christmas cycle. And cycle two is the Easter cycle. Right? So again, this is just relating to the temporal or the cycle, the proper of the seasons, not the saints' feast days necessarily, although they're connected, but mostly that's what we're talking about right now. So these two main cycles are Christmas and Easter. Now, one thing that I notice, and this is a little bit my conjecture, so I want to put an asterisk next to this. I'm noticing as I look at these things that there are phases that these seasons pass through. All right. So I noticed three main phases that each of the two big seasonal cycles pass through. So the three phases that I see are phase one, which we'll call expectation, for lack of a better term. Phase two, which we'll call celebration, again, for lack of a better term. And phase three, which we'll call integration. All right. So we have a period of reflection, a period of expectation, a period of celebration, and a period of integration. And each of those three phases makes up these two main seasonal cycles of Christmas and Easter. Now let me show you how that works. So if we take Christmas, which is the first cycle, the focus is of course on preparing for the coming of Christ in the world, preparing for the coming of Christ at the end of time, and also preparing for the coming of Christ mystically in our hearts, right? So that season actually, that kind of big chunk of the season starts at Advent with a period of expectation, right? So Advent's this period of expectation, preparation, penance. We're really kind of like looking back on the year. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? And how can we prepare ourselves spiritually for that coming of Christ at Christmas? Phase 2 again is Christmas time. So Christmas through Epiphany, which is the 12 days of Christmas, is a time of celebration. Right, so we have preparation, which usually involves fasting also, and then celebration, which is a time of feasting. And so that's Christmas through Epiphany. Then the integration phase kicks in, which is the time after Epiphany, which is also in the old calendar it's called the time after Epiphany. Now it's another section of ordinary time. So that period of ordinary time, or the time after Epiphany, is a period of integration, like I said. So we've got expectation, celebration, and integration. And so what do I mean by integration? I mean growth, discipleship, and living out the teachings of Christ in our everyday life, right? So this is the time after Epiphany, or the time, or that section of ordinary time right after Christmas. So that's the Christmas cycle. So I'm going to show you how this works out for Easter as well. So in Easter, it's the second cycle, the second main cycle of the year. The emphasis is on preparing for Christ's resurrection and triumph over death, right? So this period starts, I would say, with Lent, or in the old calendar, Septuagesima, which is a little bit earlier. And that's a period, again, of expectation. So we're looking back on, what fruit has been born in our lives. How have we kind of oriented ourselves to be receptive to it and to do the good work that God's asking of us? And what can we do to purify ourselves and sanctify ourselves and help work to make ourselves kind of more receptive and more ready for that great mystery that's going to happen on Easter, right? So that's Lent, right? Now, that's that period of expectation. Now we have this period of celebration, which is Easter. Now, Easter time is actually quite a long season. It stretches from Easter itself, Easter Sunday, through Pentecost Sunday. So that's a celebratory period. And then after Pentecost, which is the time after Pentecost, in the old calendar or in the new calendar, it's ordinary time. That's a period, again, of integration. So discipleship, living out the teachings of Christ in our ordinary lives. And I would argue that those periods of integration are really, really fruitful times for us to lean on, to lean on the lives of the saints, right? Because they provide examples of living out the teachings in daily life. So that's just as a side note. But anyways, okay, so I want to kind of give a little bit more credence to these three phases. I think I want to also say I'm very open to hearing from anyone who has some insight into this from a kind of theological viewpoint. So these three phases, I think they're accurate. I think they're really 100% there. I think they're represented in many of the teachings of the church throughout history, and also in many of the teachings of the saints. But let's talk about it. If anybody has any feedback on any of this stuff, I'd love to hear it. Another thing that I can use to back this up is that we have this concept of the purgative, illuminative, and unitive sort of phases of the spiritual journey. So these are derived from spiritual theology. They reflect the three phases of the spiritual journey. So the purgative stage, I'm not going to go into a ton of depth because this could easily become, but very lost in the weeds. But this is kind of important stuff, and it's going to help me really tie a bow on why understanding Catholic time, really benefits us spiritually, right? So the purgative stage is the process of purifying the soul through self-denial, repentance, detachment from sin, and worldly attachment, all right? So that purgative state really overlays nicely on the preparation stage that I've been talking about for the seasons. The second stage is the illuminative stage. So again, second phase in the spiritual journey. It's the stage of enlightenment, growth in virtue, and a deeper understanding of God's truth and love. All right. So this would connect to the celebratory stage that I was discussing. And now finally we have the unitive stage, which is the highest level of union with God. The soul's fully transformed and completely united continually. So again, this would be bringing that sense of integration of spiritual growth into our daily life on a continual basis and offering it up. All right, so I do think that those three phases really align nicely with these three phases of spiritual growth. The other thing I'm going to use to back this up is that I think that the sacraments overlay onto these things. And this isn't exactly my connection. So we know that the purgative, illuminative, and unitive stages have been connected with the sacraments. So that connection's been made. I'm kind of adding this time element, but again, send me links. If anybody has any research into this or any commentary on the lives of the saints or the fathers, I'd love to hear it. So the sacraments also align with the three phases. So you have baptism and penance in the purgative, or like I've been explaining, the expectation phase. Eucharist and confirmation in the celebration or illuminative phase, and then marriage and holy orders in the unitive or integration. So I'm not going to go into depth on that, just something to think about, but this just kind of gives some more credence to these three phases, all right? So now we're going to move from discussion of kind of the supernatural calendar to the natural calendar and how they're connected, all right? I find this very interesting. And I want to start with a caveat. So we're not going to posit, we're not going to say that things happen in nature and then therefore the church follows suit. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that the supernatural order supersedes nature, and everything that nature reveals to us, it's revealing about the supernatural order that God has put in place. Okay, so anything we see in nature is a manifestation of a deeper underlying supernatural reality. All right, it's not the other way around. It's not like spring is a great time, so that's when the church decided to do something. So that's not how we're presenting this. Another way of saying this is that because these supernatural realities are true, we can expect nature to reflect them. Right? So that's because the supernatural realities are true, nature reflects them. One example of this is the wise men following the star, right? So the wise men were pagans, and they were observing the phenomenon of nature to discern a deeper spiritual reality that God had put in place. They weren't putting some kind of importance on the presence of a star. They were seeing the star as a sign of something supernatural that was happening. So that's how we're looking at this, all right? First and foremost, that's super important to establish. Now what I'm going to say is that I think that there are natural cycles that reflect those three main phases that I was talking about. So again, the phases are sort of preparation, celebration, and integration. All right, so I'm going to go through some examples of how we see that in nature. So in nature, on a yearly basis, how do we see this phase of expectation or this kind of penitential phase? On a yearly basis, we see it. There's a time of leanness late in winter when everything is kind of like struggling to find food, and animals are often, that's when there's a lot of deaths in the animal world. So that time corresponds with Lent, all right? Also, there's the deep darkness of winter when the days are getting shorter, and that time corresponds with Advent, all right? So that's yearly. On a daily basis, there's also nighttime. So we have this dark nighttime that really ends at sunset, starts at sunset and ends at sunrise, right? And so that's kind of another opportunity for kind of daily expectation, daily penance, daily reflection, etc. So that's kind of the natural view of that expectational, is that a word? Expectation? Anyways, of that phase, right? So Now, the next one we can look at is this victory or celebration phase, right? That second phase, which comes after penance. So on a yearly basis, the days are starting to get longer again at the solstice, right? So that's a period of the sun is starting to return. And so that's a period of kind of natural victory over darkness, right? Then at spring, there's also the return of spring, which is, of course, a time when everyone wants to get out and party, etc. And that aligns generally with Easter, right? So that's yearly. Now, on a daily basis, we have the return of the sun every morning, it's a victory of light over dark. It's a victory of sun over nighttime. And we have that feeling when we see the sun rise. When the sun comes up on the horizon, we have that feeling. There's nothing like being, standing outside in a field out in nature and seeing the sun come up over the eastern horizon and cast its rays, through the branches with dew and to see the light glinting off all the dew on the grass. It's just a beautiful thing, and it raises your spirit. So that's a sense of celebration and victory over darkness. And now again, that final phase of integration. How does it happen yearly? We have this long period of natural toil and abundance during later spring, during summer and early fall. So we work, Easter ends, let's say Easter ends at Pentecost, and then we work. We go to work. Hopefully through the work that we're doing, bringing God's grace, bringing as vehicles, for His grace, to really glorify Him through our work, right, and to share it with the world. So that's that long period of integration, and then that's on a yearly basis, and then on a daily basis, after the morning, we have the opportunity to spend our day in work, doing good work, doing work that, again, glorifies God in the world. So these are some of the supernatural, or some of the natural signs that we see of the supernatural reality, right? Mark Walco says the Catholic principle is grace builds on nature. If it is naturally good, then it's supernaturally better. Good point. That fits in well. All right, so another place where we can see this is in a tradition, an older tradition called Ember Days. Okay, so Ember Days, historically the church commemorates the changing of the seasons with Ember Days. Ember Days are not found in the modern calendar, but they are found in the previous calendar, which is the 1962 Missal. So Ember Days are 3 days of fasting, prayer, and reflection on a seasonal basis. Typically, there's an emphasis, not typically, there is an emphasis during Ember Days on praying for priestly vocations, because very often this was a seasonal opportunity for the church to ordain new priests. So Ember Days, like I said, fasting, prayer, reflection, and also prayer for vocations. The other thing that Ember, if you go back and you read the readings for Ember Days in the older Missal, there's an emphasis on the fruits of nature. So there is definitely reference to natural goodness and to God's gifts through the natural world to us when we look deeper into Ember Days. So Ember Days is kind of like another way that the church is presenting time to us in a sanctified way, right? Because it's not just about this natural, it's not just about this natural, like Mark is saying. It's not about this natural reality. It's really about the supernatural reality that's even more important for us to notice and recognize and live into. So Ember Days happen, like I said, on a seasonal basis. There's Lent Ember Days, which is in late winter. There's Pentecost Ember Days, which just happened, and that's late spring. There's Michaelmas Ember Days, which is late summer, and then there's Advent Ember Days, which is late fall. So this can be an exciting tradition to observe, but it really holds a deep place in the history of the church, so it's something to know about at the very least. Okay, so I also, as we I'm going to wrap up kind of the discussion of how the church thinks about time. And then I'm going to talk about what the church suggests kind of we do about it. And then also we're going to talk a little bit about what's challenging about that in the modern world. But the final thing I want to touch on here as we wrap up the discussion of time is daily rhythms. So on a daily basis, the liturgical day actually starts with Vespers in the evening. So that's related to the pre-modern concept of time, which it ends up being a more mystical concept of time, and also a concept of time that's more rooted in observation of the natural world, right? So both the Jewish and the Christian, and I don't know, probably Muslim, I don't know, we'd have to look into it. I'm sure other religions as well kind of hold to this more pre-modern view of time. Have that concept that the day actually starts at sunset of the night before. That's the Jewish and Christian concept in the early time period. So in the early church and in the ancient Jewish tradition. So now my conjecture, and this is something I definitely would be open to hearing some feedback on. My conjecture is that since our seasons start with penance and expectation, and so do the sacraments, it would make sense that the hours, so the office or the liturgy of the hours, would reflect this. That Vespers would end up being something a little bit more penitential. I don't pray the office to that degree, so I'm probably not the right guy to comment on this. But if a priest or someone who prays the office on a regular basis can comment on this, given the kind of understanding that liturgical day starts the night before, starts when the sun goes down, is there kind of a more penitential spirit? Is there something that's a little bit more expectation oriented? And then, of course, there's always that element of reflection on the previous day. So I'd be interested in hearing more about that. I might even look into it and research it at some point, but just a thought. Okay, so what do we do with all this? So what is the church suggesting? I think the church is suggesting a more mystical view of time and how we relate to it. So when I say how we relate to it, I really mean how we interact with it, for sure, on a practical basis day to day, but also how does it affect us psychologically and spiritually, and ultimately kind of like reorient our view of the world and of the deeper spiritual reality that underlies everything. So the church wants us to have a more mystical view of this. And what that looks like, based on what we've just talked about, is ongoing meditation on the lives of the saints, continual, yearly, cyclical. So when I say cyclical, we're talking really like every year there's a cycle, right? Like Easter happens every year. Christmas happens every year. And so every year on a cyclical basis, we're invited to kind of go deeper into the mysteries of the faith and also to live them out in real time by participating in the liturgy. So that's the second thing. The third thing is sanctifying the seasonal transitions with periods of fasting, prayer, penance, reflection, and then reflection on also our connection to nature. I do believe that's there. And then finally, a voluntary embrace of the supernatural and natural call to these three things: expectation, celebration, and integration. Again, those are my terms. And again, we're going to have to kind of develop that a little bit as time goes on. But that's kind of where we're at with it right now. So those are the four things I think the church is suggesting for us: ongoing meditation on the lives of the saints, meditation on the mysteries of the faith, sanctifying seasonal changes, and then voluntary embrace of these kind of three factors of spiritual growth. So if the church is inviting us or suggesting that for us, then what should our response be? I think that we can only really experience the fruit of these things when we enter into them fully through practices that the church proposes. So what are those practices? Well, we know fasting, prayer, almsgiving. I'll add a few more: fasting, spiritual reading and meditation, regular attendance of the liturgy, observance of feast days with our families and communities, prayer, and then ongoing discernment and self-reflection. So that's kind of what I see as, opportunities, methods for us to go deeper on these things. I think that I should say our approach to those things should change over the course of the year according to kind of the spirit, the themes, and the spirit and the themes and kind of the intention of the season and of the day, even of the hours, etc. So we just want to be aware that we're not being super stuck in one way of doing these things, because the church is literally asking us to continually change, right? So not only is it changing throughout the course of the year, but it's also changing over the course of our lifetimes as we cyclically go deeper and deeper into these mysteries. So I think that's kind of the summary of what our response should be. Again, just my opinion. I'm totally open to hearing more feedback on this. This is the beginning of an exploration, like I said, not the end. So I do want to say that if we want to step up in that way, because I do think there's a lot of fruit in store for us. There's a lot of good things in store for us, obviously, if we do that, if we lean into this Catholic view of time and how we can interact with it. There's going to be some challenges that come up that I see. We've seen challenges to this throughout history. One of the things that happened historically that made it harder for us to kind of interact with time this way was the invention of the mechanical clock. So the mechanical clock made it possible to divide the day into equal portions and to pick midnight as the start of the new day. So that really changed how we viewed time. Like if the medieval view of time was that the day started at sunset, the idea that it started in this kind of arbitrary middle point of the night, it had a big impact on how we perceive things. It also made it possible for us to really kind of create this mechanistic view of time instead of a more kind of organic view of time. The electric light, of course, allowed day to be extended indefinitely. If you could just kind of like keep daylight in a little bulb and turn it on whenever you wanted to, obviously that had a big impact. The other big impact was more philosophical. So the Enlightenment, which was this philosophical movement in Europe that eventually culminated in the French Revolution, the Enlightenment shifted, purposefully redefined and took away and stripped away this mystical view of time and replaced it with a view of time where time was more measurable and quantifiable, right? So another thing the Enlightenment did purposefully, again, the philosophy that drove the Enlightenment called for this, it shifted our view of time away from religious observance and replaced it with secular and political observance. And I mean, we see that, everywhere we look. So that fruit is obviously borne out fully. The final thing that I see that the Enlightenment did is it took that cyclical view that I've been explaining, which is also a natural view. We always say history repeats itself. So that's a truth. And the Enlightenment proposed a more linear progressive view of time, which essentially gives us this impulse towards progress at all costs and never wanting to look back on history. Whereas Chesterton said, what do you say? Tradition is the democracy of the dead, which allows the voice of the dead to still be heard, right? Which is totally counter Enlightenment, but it is very much in keeping with the cyclical view of time that the church has provided, and that we had really from even just a natural standpoint for forever prior to the Enlightenment, really. So those are kind of historical challenges. I also see a few modern challenges. Number one is our smartphones. I really think that this is a struggle. This is definitely something that's going to hold us back from kind of maintaining that supernatural view of time. But also, it's just our mindsets, right? So the question then becomes, how do we shift our mindsets? So I'm going to lay out a practical plan, because I like to lay out practical plans. So what do we do about all this? I'm going to give you I have a 9-point plan. So the first thing is make a commitment to it. That's the first thing. Just make a commitment to it. Make a commitment to learning more about the church's view of time, about, leaning into some of these ideas and learning more and participating more in the liturgy, etc. But just make a commitment to it. Second, take time away from technology. So we developed the Saintmaker. People always ask me, why haven't we developed an app? The answer is, well, we may develop an app at some point, but it's paper for a reason. It's good to take time away from technology with a pencil and a paper and interact with something that's real, that's not virtual, that's tangible, that you can feel, that you can smell, that you can, touch. So take time away from technology and allow that kind of view of maybe a slower or more organic view of time to start to creep in. Next, I would say start to adopt some extra fasting. And the reason for that is that many of these seasons, let's say, maybe an easier way to say it is, you can't have Easter Sunday without Good Friday. You can't have celebration without preparation. So start to get better at fasting. I think that's something we could do. You can always look, you can always look at some of the older traditions of fasting and just take on a little extra and just see how that goes. Next would be to pray in rhythm with the liturgical hours. So a simple way of doing this would just be to pray the Angelus. The Angelus was typically prayed at 6 a.m., 12 a.m., and 6 p.m., which I can't remember those liturgical hours. Let's see, that would be, I think, prime, sext, and I can't remember the last one. Is it Vespers? Yeah, anyways. So the Angelus is an easy way of kind of starting to interact with the liturgical hours. Next, pray the Rosary and change, according to the mysteries that are prescribed for the week. So for the days of the week. Number 6 is to start to celebrate some special feast days in the family. So you could do name days. Name days are basically the days, like if you have kids that are named, say you have a kid named Michael, his Christian name is Michael, or if he took on a name at his confirmation, which he did, then you could celebrate the feast day of that saint. Or if, like I said, if his first name is Michael, you could celebrate. You could have an extra special party on Michaelmas. So also look at parish feasts, like big patronal feasts for the parish. And then number 7 is to read and meditate on the readings every day, and also read about the saint of the day. This can be done in 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be super long. Don't make it some big onerous thing that you're never going to follow through on. And be flexible with it, like everything. The next would be start a seasonal cycle of personal reflection and assessment, similar to what Advent, or what kind of that spirit behind Ember Days. And then at Advent and Easter, and this is a big one, make a special effort to keep the attitude of the season and do some deep discernment. So in episode 1 and 2 of this podcast, I suggest doing kind of like deep dive goal setting during Advent, or like during the time of Christmas, somewhere around there. And then also again, like late in Lent, or maybe before Pentecost, but it's basically in that kind of ballpark, right? So I do give some practical suggestions for how that might be, but really, like, you can simply look at, what the church is presenting to us in the readings, and allow that to kind of guide your discernment and your kind of preparation during those periods. So one other thing I wanted to mention is that, the Saintmaker itself, which is our Catholic Life Planner, is designed to help you do this stuff more organically and easily. A few ways that it does that is that you can, your weekly rule of life helps you really create like a weekly rhythm, right? The prayer plan allows you to create a prayer plan which can easily evolve throughout the year, because we're asking you to kind of like update it on a continual basis. The daily examine provides a great opportunity for daily reflection. The seasonal journal allows for kind of a restart and that Ember Days like time of reflection, growth, and discernment. Both forms of the liturgical calendar are included, and then we have the norms for both traditional and modern fasting and feasting, so that's in there. And then the final thing, which I think is very a huge opportunity, really, like I see it as a treasure chest of just gold, really, for growth in this stuff, is our feast and devotions pages, which give you suggestions for going deeper with the liturgical calendar. So, all right, so I don't want to, it's not a sales pitch, but I'm just kind of, it's important because I know there's a lot of Saintmaker users out there who are trying to think about how to kind of like fit all this stuff together. So I wanted to mention that. All right, so that's pretty much all I had to say about this, but I do want to take some time to answer some questions, if anybody has any questions. So Nick Palomino says, I already ordered my summer Saintmaker. I'm excited. Thank you for these tutorial videos. Yeah, absolutely, Nick. Nikki. You're welcome. Thanks for being a customer. Very exciting to have you on board. And then Mark had commented, he had said the Catholic principle is grace builds on nature. If it is naturally good, it is supernaturally better. Yes. Another way I think of looking at that is that you have, so grace builds on nature, right? We're given kind of like our nature, and then from that, God's grace helps us to build something up that's even more glorious, which then can be kind of returned to the source, of course, which is God Himself. And then we have an anonymous user on Facebook who said, I've never heard of Ember Days until I looked into purchasing one of your planners. Yeah, Ember Days are an exciting opportunity. There's another blog post that I put up, I think last year or maybe the year before, on Ember Days on our website. So if you go to thesaintmaker.com/blog, you can search for Ember Days, and you can read that article, which is it's a complete guide to Ember Days. So that could be a good resource to check out. All right. So in conclusion, I just want to kind of review what we covered. So we covered the cycle of the saints, which is a sanctoral cycle. We covered the temporal cycle, which is a cycle of seasons. We covered the two major seasonal cycles, Christmas and Easter. We talked about supernatural and natural, like the connections between the supernatural and the natural that can help us to kind of go deeper if we understand them better. We talked about Ember Days and seasonality. We talked about daily rhythms. And we talked about what the church is teaching or asking of us with all of this and what our response should be. We also covered a bit about challenges. So the challenges were, related to sort of like the facts about the modern world, but also some of the choices we make in terms of, especially keeping that smartphone on us all the time, avoiding silence at all costs. And then finally, I kind of laid out a practical plan, and we talked a little bit about how the Saintmaker can help. All right, so that's the summary. And then finally, I wanted to talk about next week on the Saintmaker podcast. So we're going to try to do this every Friday around noon Eastern time, although we were a little later today. I think we started at like 12:30, but so it's going to be somewhere around there. But yeah, you can keep an eye on our channels around noon, and you should see a notification. One thing that you should do is subscribe, like the video. On YouTube, you can click on the notification bell, which will notify you when we go live. So that would all be good. I do have a question. If anybody wants to have any topics covered, either like me solo or with guests, just comment, let us know in the comments whether you want to hear, for instance, more Catholic time stuff, whether you want to hear more goal setting stuff, or whether you want to hear something else entirely. So, the comments are a good place for that. And then finally, I wanted to one more time mention Saintmaker pre-order sale, 15% off, ends June 15th. Go to saintmaker.com/shop to shop the sale. All right. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and I hope that was helpful. Let us know in the comments if it was, how it was, what you're learning from this, and we'll see you next time. God bless.